Welcome to COVID and Climate Change Correlations, a weekly video podcast where I, Daniel Sanderson, engage in a stimulating conversation with post-Keynesian economist Steve Keen. Absolutely. So I want to welcome everybody to the third episode of COVID and climate change. I think the way this series is going to unfold is that right at the beginning of the episodes, we should really focus on exactly what the series is all about, is COVID and climate change. And then we'll let it kind of disintegrate into whatever topics that seem to grab us. But the idea is a counterfactual into the future, thinking about COVID and what lessons we've learned from COVID and what mistakes we might most likely do again.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I throw a lot of stuff at you, Steve, about potential scenarios, and I think more than likely, if there's going to be any adaptation to the economic models that you put forward, where do you see them infiltrating in the first step, right?
Well, it's mainly still the continued resistance of mainstream thinking that'll stop it happening easily. I mean, I gave a talk yesterday or a day before at a book launch for Michael Hudson for a new book of his coming out shortly. This was the launch for China, and as part of it, I was on my treadmill, and of course, as one does, I put on the headphones and was watching a YouTube video. And on my phone, I don't have a premium subscription, so I get ads. And lo and behold, there's Paul Krugman touting his latest class in economics, done through one of these, I should actually try to put one together myself, I suppose, through one of these services. And this is the promo video. And at one point he says, how's it all work? He says, it's about people. And the next slide says, it's not about money.
Oh, my.
And I thought, here's this bullshit again. And so I used that as a little juxtaposition of Michael's work, which is all about money and finance and the power of the financial sector and so on, and how it's distorted capitalism and allowed a rentier class to take over from the entrepreneurs. And I just went through and ridiculed, again, Krugman's approach to money. But the trouble is, and one of the reasons I've got an extra license to ridicule him today, compared to how we had a battle over this in 2012, I think it was, on the internet, is that in 2014, the Bank of England came out and said, as much as told, Paul, your model's wrong. There was a paper. Have you seen that paper in 2014?
Yeah.
Money Creation in the Modern Economy. And it literally says the textbook models are wrong. Banks do not take in deposits and lend them out. And banks do not use reserves, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I found instances of Krugman making exactly those same false claims in 2015 and 2021, as well as before the paper came out. And the trouble is, it's very easy to fall back into conventional thinking, even after something as disturbing as the global financial crisis and COVID. So the trouble is that, in this sense, the real world is providing more and more proof that the approach that I'm part of, I'm not the originator, but the idea that banks create money when they lend, and then the macroeconomic impact of that, and the fact that once you analyze capitalism that way, none of the supply and demand stuff works anymore, makes any sense at all. But we're the minority, and people fall back into the conventional beliefs. I think there's more skepticism in the public about the mainstream to some extent, but most people aren't interested in this stuff.
Yeah.
So you just don't get breakthrough. And the only real change, I think, comes when the profession itself shifts its entire mind. And my analogy is always to go back to Copernicus, Galileo, Tycho Brahe, Kepler, all the people who gave us the sun-centric vision of the world. But we still talk about sunrise and sunset.
I was going to say, and Max Planck. Remember that? We have to.
Again, Max. Yeah. So it isn't the case that the majority of people will continue believing what the dominant profession says is reality, ultimately, whether that's right or wrong. Okay. Now, normally, because we're living in the age of science, the dominant discipline is correct. Okay. And then because the textbooks teach it, you learn it at school, even if you're not doing like astronomy. No one in any class anywhere on the planet, I hope, gets a school textbook that opens up and shows the Earth as the center of the universe. Okay. So in that sense, even though you don't become an astronomer, you get the understanding the astronomers have that the Earth is a planet orbiting a sun, which is orbiting a galaxy, which is part of the universe, and that's our position. But if we were still back in the days of Ptolemy, and Copernicus was a minority figure, you'd open up your school textbook and you'd see a vision of there's the Earth at the center of the universe, and things fall down because they think things go towards the center, and things decay in the Earth, and things are perfect in the heavens, etc., etc. So the trouble is, while we remain a minority, and I think the realistic approach to economics that I'm part of, the post-Keynesians, aligned a bit with evolutionary theorists, aligned with Schumpeterian visions of innovation and capitalism, etc., etc. That will be a minority, I think, until the death of capitalism.
Yeah.
And the death of capitalism is going to occur this century, courtesy of climate change, because if we build a society that can survive it, it won't be dominated by the market. It'll be a command economy, with the market playing an ancillary role as the market did during the Second World War. And so I just don't think we're going to break through.
Well, I actually haven't really heard that term used so fluently, but the idea of a command economy literally is like, would it be similar to a junta sort of control of?
Oh, if you go back and look at what happened in World War II, I mean, we still had democratic elected presidents, elected prime minister. I don't know, were elections held during the Second World War? America's elections are every 4 years. It's quite possibly had 42. Was it 40 and 44 or 42 and 46 for the elections?
Good. Yeah, that's a good thing. I will look that up.
Yeah,
maybe update.
But like in the UK, I have a feeling, I'm not sure. I think elections would have been suspended during the war. Obvious reason, you're under attack. You have a government of national unity. So your political system starts off still with the whatever was decided by your democratic system before the crisis began. And then they are the commander in chief in the UK was Winston Churchill until he lost the election after the war was won. So you start off with you would have the remnants of your politically selected system in charge, but there would be, just as we have rules that COVID implies, you must wear a mask, isolation, et cetera, enforced not by a market system but by command. And if you don't do it, you get penalised, you get fined, and you get jailed. That is the nature of a command economy. Now, in that command economy, you've still got firms producing output, selling that output, but the overall direction of the economy is set by the command system, and the finances. When you look at it, the finances are generated by the command system. So if we look at what happened during COVID, apparently, I haven't checked the figures properly, but I believe that the deficit America ran during 2020 was equivalent to 30% of GDP. Okay. Now, without that, there would have been a total crash of the economy. I'm glad that it was of that scale, but the same thing applied in the Second World War. Again, the deficit in America was running at about 25 to 30% of GDP every year, and that was money being created. This is the endogenous money explanation and understanding of what's going on. The deficit creates the money and creates the reserves in double entry bookkeeping terms. The reserves are used to buy the war bonds. So the money is created to finance the war effort. The financing of the war effort enables corporations to remain profitable. even though they're not selling cars anymore, they're selling tanks. Okay.
Yeah.
So you still have a market system, but subordinate to the command system, where the ultimate objective of the command system in the Second World War was to defeat the Nazis and the Japanese. And the command system we will be under in climate change will be to drastically reduce our burden on the planet as fast as possible, and to start bringing in dramatic increase in carbon reducing energy technologies, and probably, as I said, I expect rationing to occur on a grand scale as well. And if the state's not doing it, then it'll be Mad Max.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I know a lot of people are going to say, this is dreadful, this is globalist agenda, all the usual bullshit that you get from the right-wing conspiracy freaks on the internet. But this is being forced on us by a failure of the right wing, of the neoclassicals and the major corporate interests, the Koch brothers and so on, hadn't deluded us about the dangers we face. We could have done it using a market system. Instead, it'll be command-based, and there'll be you won't be you'll have rationing of carbon. You'll have a dramatic rationing in what you can actually consume. But there'll still be firms producing it and still making a profit, but the profit will be generated effectively by the cash being created by the government.
Yeah, I want to speculate a little bit about incentive, and I have a two-pronged question, because I know you can spin a lot in your brain there. So the first one is, let's speculate about some incentives that would help an average American, an average Australian, an average anybody, a global citizen, to want to advocate for this this shift in economic model. And I have some guesses. But the other aspect that I'm curious about, so this would be the second question that I'm going to throw your way, is what do you think about a hybrid market system that is it possible to still have a hybrid market system, like partial market system, partial command economy?
Oh, it would be. It's always going to be partial. I mean, the government didn't build the tanks. Okay, it gave a contract. I don't know who actually made Sherman tanks and things like that. It's worth taking a look and seeing who manufactured them. But what you had was the government saying the budget includes allocation for 30,000 Sherman tanks per year. And so you therefore make a budget allocation to pay for 30,000 Sherman tanks a year, and you pay that money. Let's take a look and see who made Sherman tanks. I don't even know. But most widely made the M4 Sherman and the Lend-Lease system. Boom, boom, boom. Who manufactured it?
American Locomotive Company, Baldwin.
Okay, well, I didn't even know about them. But okay, so but that firm would have made an enormous profit out of selling that tank, and rightly so, as part of successful effort against the Nazis. But the money that bought it was created by government fiat, and then the money that it used, it then hired the workers, a lot of whom were female, of course. This is back in the days of Rosie the Riveter. The men were in the army. The women were back making the weapons. But capitalism remained profitable during the World War II, and in fact, I expect it was a highly profitable period, because if you take a look at the level of corporate debt, it more than halved, I think, between 1939, when you started getting the Lend-Lease program, when the Americans were sending tanks to the British in return for later payment. But from 1939 on, it was a very profitable period for American capitalism, and they reduced their level of debt by a factor of, cut it at least in half. So it's possible to be profitable during this period, but only because the government is creating the money. And the first expenditure of that money, it adds to aggregate demand, and then the money circulating continues to add to aggregate demand. So you can be profitable, but the direction for the economy is being set not by consumer taste, but by the government directive, which in World War II was defeat the Nazis. In climate change, it'll be drastically reduce our load on the planet before civilization collapses.
Yeah. That's horrific. And I actually think that there's a claim that can be made to have people stay at home.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, well and truly.
Like an economic model to say you're actually more valuable to take a similar type of role in your home structure and not go out and not commute, not participate in GDP. And so this is the issue that I have when I'm trying to scaffold this, try and understand. Essentially, I'm trying to build up an ideology in my head, really. I'm trying to think, well, look, it makes more sense to have people stay at home. Where's the incentive? Yeah. Congratulations, 40 plus people, everybody beyond the age of 25, you've just got instant retirement. Holy shit, Steve. Is that an incentive or what? Like, literally, don't go to work and say, can we make the financial claim that you actually have early retirement? Now, I want you to imagine a graph for a minute, right? I mean, this is easy enough to do. You've got the percentage of the population that's unemployed. And let's just say that fluctuates between 5% and 10%. I mean,
for America, that's a reasonable range. You have recorded unemployment. Yeah.
Okay. And then you have the rest of the workforce that still doesn't penetrate the 50% mark. You still have like almost 50% of the population that's unemployed or not working by choice, right?
Yeah, yeah. Well, you have, I mean, when you think about the working population, it's effectively people between 15 and 64. That's, younger than 15, you're expected to be in school. Older than 64, you're expected to be retired. So, and when you look at the demographics these days, that itself is going to be pretty close to half the population. It's about 40%, I think, in America. So roughly 60% of the population is available for employment. Now, when you look at something like global warming, a large contribution to global warming comes out of consumption. And consumption involves production as well. I mean, I find it quite amusing going, because my wife is an inveterate shopper, and going shopping with her, up and down the corridors of the supermarkets, and just looking for stuff that's interesting. There is so much stuff. Now, this it isn't just the stuff; it's the variety of stuff, and this is an important thing about capitalism. It is an evolutionary system. Competition is evolutionary. It is not perfect competition. That's a total load of bullshit produced by neoclassical economists back in the 19th century. Totally inappropriate way to look at capitalism. What you do get is a massive evolutionary diversity of products, and it's an evolutionary marketplace people compete in. And with the frivolous incomes we have, there's an enormous amount of frivolous stuff that's out there being produced. And there'll be like, there's 35 varieties of toilet paper. Okay. Okay. And that's pretty much what you'll find in any major supermarket. There are thousands of different types of cooking utensils, different brands. Okay. When you get something like a World War II, which we've actually, of course, been through, or climate change, which we haven't yet, but we're going to on the same scale, greater scale, you don't want that stuff produced, and you don't want to consume. You want everything to go towards what the war effort needed in 39 to 45, and what we're going to need to survive climate change. So you don't want people in the factories. You don't want them shopping for this stuff. So a large part of the war effort was rationing. And one of my favorite elements of that was you didn't drink coffee anymore because coffee had to be imported, and you didn't want to risk ships. You wanted your ships to be sending tanks to England. You didn't want the ships to be heading down to pick up the coffee from south of the border. So people had to drink chicory. That was, you could grow that as a local substitute for coffee. I quite like chicory, by the way. I tried it out of curiosity. But that meant you rationed. There was no longer, 30 varieties of coffee, instant coffee anymore. There was one very expensive and chicory, and you got a ration for chicory and not for coffee. And you had ration cards. And I expect much the same thing will happen with modern technology, but the same idea, to drastically reduce the number of factories that are involved in producing this stuff, which means the people who used to work in the factories, you don't want them working there anymore. If you can't reallocate them to the climate change process, you want them back at home. And so in that sense, you'd have a universal basic income being produced for people to live on, enabling them to buy the limited range of commodities that would be necessary to stay alive.
Yeah.
And then everything else, your reproductive resources, as much as you wanted to employ of them, because you wouldn't want to employ any to, there'd be a point where we say, that's it, shut down all coal. This is deadly. No more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Okay? Bang. We're going to realize that one day. It's going to be a brick wall type reaction. And therefore, you don't want the energy demands to exceed your capacity to produce without generating CO2. Now, that is going to mean, it could mean, a 90% fall in energy consumption. Okay? Now, how do you do it? Well, you suddenly devote much more of your time to producing forms of energy extraction. That's what we're doing. We're not creating energy, we're extracting it from somewhere, which are non-carbon generating. But there's a limited need that the workforce you need to do that at the scale you can do it will not employ everybody.
Yeah.
And you want to make sure that the factories that are, you're not going to be allowing anybody to produce a different form of napkin to, if that's going to add to your carbon budget. You're going to say there's one form of napkin, that's it. Maybe allow 2 or 3. So the huge diversity of product we take for granted will disappear. And rather than purchasing power, it's going to be rationing power.
Yeah, I actually thought a good way to do that would be somewhat similar to a cheese quota, right? So we have an oil quota, and Canada has so much oil that they're allowed, and America has the same issue. Every country around the world would have a ration of oil supply, and I know that does open up a can of worms, so to speak. But the biggest one for me is the number of people in the particular country. So if you could say that just for our conversation, that America is the dominant superpower, so they're saying, well, we're not going to agree to any per capita allocation of oil disbursement. We're actually, because India and China would get much more oil because they have more population.
Yeah.
And so it's the same like the universal basic income. I actually was trying to try and stay as close to the status quo as possible in terms of income. So if you look at the United States, they have an average income per person of approximately $60,000 a year. That's crazy. That's amazing. Right, compared to a lot of countries. But what we would be saying is, here's the proposition, folks. Here's what you get instantly. Everybody gets that amount of money. Well, we don't have to argue about it. Everybody in America gets that amount of money. You have, then I'm trying to figure out what are the inflationary triggers that we would have to watch out for. We don't want everybody to go to Amazon and start buying a shitload of product, but in a way, we could let them do that. It would kind of just settle out. You know what I mean? So then that 60,000 might be worth 24, whatever it is. It's kind of like a settling factor.
Well, there's actually an important point here, and it's not the average salary; it's the median salary.
Right.
Because I'm sure anybody listening to this and hearing the average of 60,000 will see a lot of. If we had an audience which was representative of the whole of America, then 90% of them would have an income well below 60,000 a year. Okay, you're talking per adult too. That means a household will go 120,000 for a 2-couple household. That's far in excess of what most people earn, and the reason is we have an incredibly skewed income distribution.
Yeah,
and if you in that case, if you gave everybody the average, you'd be giving a pay rise to 90% of the population.
There's your votes, man.
Okay. Now, and that's partly why I proposed the idea of a carbon rationing scheme initially, before, once we realize how serious it is, before just how serious it is really hits us in the face, then I want to have a universal carbon credit as a parallel currency to money, where you'd get every day you'd get a UCC allowance through your central bank digital currency bank account. And when you went shopping, you'd be paying the carbon price as well as the money price. And we could set the ration at the average of carbon consumption, which again is just about as skewed as income. So 90% would find they would not exhaust their ration, but 10% or 5% or 2% would drastically exhaust their ration and have to buy off the poor. So you'd have an income redistribution scheme going that way. And then at a later point, when the seriousness became apparent, just how bad things were, then that UCC, Universal Carbon Credit Account, would become the price system. And there'd be, effectively wealth would be on hold. You'd all be living off that ration. And we'd be, in that sense, in the sort of world that existed in World War II, where you're all in it together because, if one of you had to learn German, everybody had to learn German, okay, if you fail. Yeah. And if you succeed, then it takes everybody's effort at the same time. And that effort includes not wasting money on frivolous consumption, which was why war bonds were sold, because that took spending power out of people's hands. Okay. The war bonds did not finance the war. The war bond side to the public took money out of the public's hands so that they didn't have it to spend on this nonsense stuff in the first place. And a rationing mentality meant that people work. If you did anything which was conspicuous consumption, you were conspicuous and you were an asshole. Okay. So we need a similar attitude as well for what's going to come our way in climate change.
Well, this is the first I hear about this parallel system of like a carbon spend. I love it. I think that's a really great idea. That's really cool. You've thought about this then, have you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was when I realized just how bad the work of neoclassical economists was on climate change, it just threw into dark relief that we've wasted 50 years when we could have been addressing this challenge by gradually reducing our load on the planet, by trying to reduce not just income inequality and population at the same time. All the stuff the limits to growth spoke about in 72, we could have started in 75 as they wanted us to do, and this would all have just happened in the background with the market system. When I realized just how much neoclassicals have helped delay, and it threw into dark relief what I already knew about things like a human ecological footprint, the amount of the planet's resources we're already consuming. And I thought, we've just got to go backwards as fast as we can, but there's no way the burden of going backwards can be placed on the poor, because given income inequality now, and it's much worse than it was 50 years ago, if you made everybody pay equally, the poor would starve to death. So you would be facing a Mad Max world, well and truly. You have to do it in a way that the burden is posed on the wealthy. And then the idea was, well, use central bank digital currencies, not for money, but for universal carbon credit, dual price system. Then when you go shopping, you spend both your wallet and your UCC. The wallet can be reimbursed by your pay, by government spending, welfare payments and things like that. But the UCC is only topped up by the central bank every day. And there'll be people who in one day would consume as much carbon as 365 of their fellow Americans. Hi, Bill. And with that, to do that consumption, they'd have to pay. So what you would have is a scheme which would initially, if we weren't actually trying to drastically reduce total consumption at the point, just setting up the scheme, 90 to 95% of the population would benefit. And you need something which is politically feasible like that to bring it in, because anything else would face the resistance that you saw with the Gilets jaunes in France 2 or 3 years ago.
So this is interesting. I'm just trying to imagine it's the people who are on the far right, the climate change deniers, and even the ones that do not deny climate change, that are a little bit more just like, hey, Steve, Dan, you guys are overreacting. We've got plenty of resort, this kind of stuff, right?
Like garbage, yeah.
And so and the problem is that you've got a democracy. So those are the ones that can run kicking and screaming, say, I'm not going to vote for that. So under your proposal here, you're saying that they can spend. they can fly to Vegas for a weekend. They can do whatever they want in this transitionary sort of period, but they just have to shell out cash for it.
Yeah. That's the idea. And, because we're not going to do anything before climate change becomes brutally obvious. Okay? That's clearly the case. So I support all the people who are trying to work in favor of, the 1.5 degree target and the 2 degree target, et cetera, et cetera. But I'm just, I think life and reality have made me very cynical about humans' capacity to change direction in the collective sense before a crisis. They never do. It's only after the war is declared that you realize you're in one.
Yeah. Your friend you mentioned in the first episode, he's from the I think the Central Bank of England or something. He was a neoclassical economist from the Bank of England. He was a friend you mentioned. You're kind of picking on
Michael Klimov. Yeah.
Yeah, what would he say about this type of thing? Is it something that he could envision rolling out from, the Bank of England, it's a pretty impressive bank.
In terms of the digital currency, well, Michael's not actually working on that. The people who are working on that, it went into suspension for a while, and now it's back being worked on once more. And I think there's also work in Russia, in China, and I believe there's actually even a group in America, like in the Federal Reserve, who are looking at bringing in a central bank digital currency.
Wow!
And it's all been done because they just think they might as well give it a try. I mean, partly this is there was part of the Federal Reserve and some others that wanted to eliminate cash. Okay, now I think this is a stupid idea, partly because I don't want people getting rid of one form of money who don't understand money at all, and that's neoclassical economists, not including Michael. Michael does understand money, but the vast majority haven't got a bloody clue about the monetary system. That's why my little quote from Paul Krugman on it's not about money. And yet these people run the Federal Reserve. So they're one of their ways to try to attempt to stimulate the economy after the global financial crisis was to bring about negative interest rates. And the idea was if you have a negative interest rate in your bank account, that will encourage you to spend. Okay, so they thought they could stimulate the economy with negative interest rates. Now, the central bank itself can't impose negative interest rates on commercial banks. They can impose negative interest rates on the reserves that commercial banks have at the Federal Reserve. And so they if you had, say, 10 trillion in reserves and they charged a 10% rate of interest negative on that, your asset would be costing you, $1 trillion a year. But the thing is, the private banks themselves, if they then tried to pass on that negative interest rate to deposit accounts, then the depositors would take their money out in cash.
Yeah.
So rather than enabling, they thought, let's abolish cash.
Yeah.
And then we could put in there, I think you guys don't understand money in the first place. Get your asses out of here. So I'm, as opposed, and I still am opposed to the idea of abolition of cash. But that's why the central bank digital currency sort of idea got popularity amongst the mainstream economists. Then they realized that if they actually set it up and central bank digital currencies competed with the private banks, then people would be encouraged with a higher safety of a Federal Reserve account to put their money there rather than the private banks. You have a massive imbalance in the assets and liabilities of the private banks. You could send them bankrupt. So they backed off for a while, and now it seems to be coming back in again. I'm not quite certain why. But I want to see that structure in place. I want to see central banks give every adult in the country a digital account at the central bank, because I think that can be the channel through which we can ultimately bring in a universal carbon credit.
Right. No, I think that's a brilliant idea, and I think anything I can do to move that project forward, I'll definitely do it. I want to let you know about a little surprise because you'd mentioned something about a course, an economics course, and so I took the liberty to outline one, and yeah, it was just an
Okay.
entry level one, but I think what happens is that as I own a media outlet and a little small publishing firm, and anything that we can do to break through this action potential that is, society. It's difficult to break through with messaging, right?
Mm.
And I have a mainstay that I want to do so in a very organic way. It's the best way to do it. Just like our conversation, you're providing a
Hmm.
tremendous amount of value. So, anyways, yeah, I wanted to get that in front of you, and even if it was an entry level one, I think we could go back and correct some stuff, refocus some stuff, and make it a little bit more like uh, a new Keynesian model. You know what I mean? And
Hmm.
put some narrative in there that kind of helps the cause, right? And offer that course. I think I could turn that around in approximately 30 days. So yeah, what do you think about that?
Well, I want to do it. The trouble is I'm overloaded. I mean, for my sins, because neoclassical economics is so pervasive and so bad, when you look at the intellectual foundations of it, I find myself fighting it on half a dozen bloody fronts all the time. And it comes, if I wasn't doing it, there would be nobody else doing it. Not that I'm the only person critical by far. There's plenty, but the rest seem to be caught up in the university courses, or they're working in one or two areas, not the whole caboodle. And I find myself spread across the whole caboodle. And oh my God, if I wanted to write a decent course, then first of all, I've got to finish the manual for Minsky, which is modeling of Minsky, which is partially a course in one sense, I suppose.
Yep.
Then I have to write, I've still got to finish the paper for the Proceedings of the Royal Society on Nordhaus, which deadline is the end of this month. And then I'll go out the third edition of Debunking Economics. And after I've done that, maybe I can think about a course while I'm helping develop parallel currency, the idea of the carbon credit system as well. So, I think if I'm lucky, maybe I can start something like about in April or June of next year. And
yeah. But Steve, we got to put our heads together on this because, let me throw a few ideas. Like, I can go to some of the universities and advocate on your behalf to try and see if we can get some postgraduates or, something like this, right? We have work to do. Can we at least not ask the question and start?
Oh, yeah, but there the trouble is the curriculum is set by the neoclassicals. So most of the universities would laugh you out of the building.
Really?
If you came, oh, shit, yeah, totally. One of the problems about the last 15 years since the financial crisis is that neoclassicals are even more dominant now than they were beforehand. And whereas in the past they used to ignore characters like me, now they see us as the enemy. And when I look at the extent to which there are universities teaching non-orthodox economics, it's a pitiful handful. And like all the mainstream are dominated by, all the major universities are dominated by neoclassicals. And then you have a handful of non-orthodox ones. But even there, the neoclassicals are always trying to undermine any rival way of thinking, in the same sense that if you had a department of religion, each of the different religions would be trying to take over the entire department. Well, that's economics. And neoclassical has taken over all of them. Like back in Australia, for example, I got a colleague, one of my ex-master students is going back to Australia just for family reasons. And he asked me, what's the state of post-Keynesian economics in Australia? And I used to run, I was one of the leading actors of a non-orthodox economics department at Western Sydney. That's been destroyed by the administration rather than by neoclassicals, I might add. Kingston, that's been destroyed. And Leeds in UK has a bit of a non-orthodox course. SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies that That has a non-ethical course. Greenwich offers a bit of a non-mainstream. King's College has got one or two non-mainstream course, but that's it. And then you look around the rest of the country, it's Oxford, Cambridge, or Manchester, all the mainstream universities, it's all neoclassical.
Okay.
So you just, you're going to find no customers.
Right. Okay. No. Okay. And I'll always throw ideas your way. So what if I tried to get other economists on the show? I mean, not necessarily, we bring them into this ecosystem. We're starting to ask them questions and bring them into the conversation. Is that something that, I mean, I know you can hold your own, whether it's separately recorded conversations with different economists, but we got to get this conversation going.
Why don't you give it a try with Paul Krugman?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And not with me, just have him on.
Okay. And
don't hit him with my views until very late in the show. And just see if you can, see what I expect him to be extremely disparaging towards you. And that's all nonsense. This is all wrong. It's quite one of his favorite phrases. So it is intellectual opposition to alternative thought. And normally that's a healthy thing in a discipline. Okay.
Exactly what you were saying. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
It's unhealthy in economics because it's a pre-Copernican discipline.
Right.
It still works on the great books. If you're not consistent with Samuelson, you're not economics. And that's as I said, they're zealots. They believe they're scientists. They're in fact zealots for a vision of capitalism, which is completely incorrect, but persuasive to them. And it describes a perfect system. And their objective in life is to make the real world more like their textbooks.
Yeah.
Now, that is the resistance that puts up to alternative thought is enormous. And they can parody anybody else as being, a waffler, not looking at the whole system, et cetera, et cetera. Another fun thing I saw, just to give you a little instance here, there was a debate. I've got to see if I can locate where it was with Olivia Blanchard, Paul Krugman, Larry Summers, and a few others. And they were talking about the dominant models, neoclassical models, which are called dynamic, stochastic, general, equilibrium models. And Larry, at one point, one of the wits in economics, came out and said, well, I thought I'd take the opposing case. Well, what's the opposite to dynamic, stochastic, general, equilibrium? He said, well, it's static, deterministic, partial, but he also said equilibrium.
Oh, shit.
Okay. He could not think of non-equilibrium.
Chaos, right?
Okay. Yeah. And they say this is that they are simply not aware of the whole idea of nonlinear systems, chaotic dynamics, far from equilibrium dynamics, et cetera, et cetera. So he could think of an dynamic, static, okay?
Yeah.
Stochastic, deterministic.
Yeah.
General, partial. Equilibrium, well, there's only equilibrium.
Oh, shit. Everything's, yeah. Good catch. I like that. That one's rather obvious to me. I'd probably catch that one first.
Yeah. But that's, unfortunately, they don't believe you can. And this is what's built into their way of thinking. Like there's a classic paper by Ed Lazaire, who was Bush's chief economic advisor, 2004 to 2009. Of course, the handover, the term of the presidency is longer than the 4 years. So he was in charge when the global financial crisis hit. And I've met him. He died last year or the year before, I think, not of COVID. And a nice guy. I like him. Which is not a common reaction to neoclassicals, I've got to say, but he's a nice bloke. And he wrote a paper in 2000 called Economic Imperialism. And it was published by the QJE, which is the Quarterly Journal of Economics, the most dominant mainstream journal. So they agreed with the sentiments expressed in the paper. And it basically said economics is the only science in the social sciences and we should take over everything. And his reason why we are the economics is the science is because economic has the concept of equilibrium.
Oh, my.
Okay. So it is so deeply ingrained in their thinking, they can't imagine anything other than an equilibrium approach. Now, if you come along and say non-equilibrium, they think, oh, that means you can't model. They are really, quite literally, 60 years behind the genuine sciences, the real sciences, because 1963 was when Lorenz published deterministic aperiodic systems, which was his explanation of chaos theory in weather. And from that point on, there has been an acceptance of the need to have systems of non-equilibrium dynamics to model most real-world systems. But the neoclassicals still think you've got to use, pardon the French, fucking equilibrium, and I'm sick of it.
So this question about equilibrium, I'm trying to imagine what they envision equilibrium like. Is it because of the system, the Fed can set the rates and everybody can balance it, we can flood with bonds, and just you can kind of just put it in this nice fudge factor of equilibrium? Is that what they're actually referring to?
No, it's pretty much they have a vision of capitalism as a system to coordinate people's desires and wants relative to the costs of satisfying those wants. Mm-hmm. And the one point in which you reach a point of maximal satisfaction of people's wants, given the constraints, is an equilibrium, whether that's a general equilibrium in the Walrasian sense or a game theory type equilibrium in the Nash sense, or you have what they call Pareto optimality, where you get a point where you can't make anybody else better off without making somebody else worse off. Those are the sort of the three large categories of equilibrium that they work in terms of. And they believe that's what capitalism drives you towards, and any market intervention from unions to at the social organisation level to governments at the other will disturb that equilibrium. So they've turned equilibrium into a religion about capitalism.
So where's your fine point? I get the opposition to equilibrium in terms of a definition, but what's your counter to that then?
Well, any living system is out of equilibrium. Period. Okay.
So let's just not classify it as an equilibrium.
Yeah, equilibrium is a state of a dead system. Okay. If you find something dead, it's an equilibrium. Like my favorite illustration of the importance of non-equilibrium thinking in genuine dynamic systems is the simple act of walking. Okay. When you are walking, you're in a non-equilibrium position. If you try to maintain equilibrium, if you think about when you take a step, okay, then you take another step. What happens if you don't take the other step? You fall on your bloody face. Okay. Yeah. Now, that was actually discovered by accident by the engineers who designed the first walking robot. I think it was Sony with I think it was called Echo robot. And they tried to make it walk. And the first thing they did was set up the algorithm so that the robot made sure its center of gravity was between its feet.
Right.
Okay. And what they found was all they had to do was shuffle.
Yeah.
Okay. Because if you want to maintain your center of gravity so it's between your feet, you can only shuffle. But if you take a large stride, which what we do when we walk, you're going to fall over. So they finally realized they had to break that algorithm and require to walk, it had to go in a non-equilibrium state where it was falling and would take a step so that it wouldn't fall on its face. And then it could walk naturally. So walking is a non-equilibrium process. Now, if walking is a non-equilibrium process, what the hell isn't?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I have 2 points on this. I want to go to a cellular point, and then I want to start bringing in Mr. Nassim Taleb, because I think it triggered something on an anti-fragile sort of response, right?
But
if I go to some of the work of Antonio Damasio, for example, he studies Bayesian networks in counterfactuals. Mm-hmm. And so he's a neurologist, I believe. Mm-hmm. I love his work because he relates it to culture, and he relates homeostasis all the way down to the cellular level. Mm-hmm. And so, and effectively, this is essentially life. It's, even plants are going to move to a state of homeostasis or against a threat sort of thing. So in what you've described of moving, of staying in kind of a constant flux, like a homeostatic state is is not ideal. You want to be moving towards that.
No, there are different. I mean, when genuine scientists look at what economists call equilibrium, they normally throw their hands up in horror, because there's a whole range of definition of equilibrium in sciences. Like if you have in statistical mechanics, which is if you involve looking at gases, then they will define the air in the room you're in as being in equilibrium, but it doesn't mean the molecules aren't moving. Okay, I mean, they're colliding with each other all the time, but the overall pressure is the distribution of atoms is one of many billions upon billions upon billions of distributions where the pressure is uniform throughout the room. Okay, now only so that's the definition of equilibrium in statistical mechanics. Is very, very different to what neoclassical is talking about, because their vision of equilibrium is fundamentally a mechanical definition, where you have a mechanical object which is resting. So, like this, I mean, this bottle I've got here, if I can bring it close to me so you see it. I put it down; it's in equilibrium. Okay, now if I push it, okay, it's going to fall. Okay, it actually has three equilibria. This thing it can be here, it can be up there, or it can be on its side. And by far, the dominant equilibrium is when it's on its side. But if you had it on its side, it wouldn't hold water. Okay, so you want it to be in the least stable of the three equilibria that it has. That's your preferred state for your bottle. That's just a static object. In the real world, we are being bombarded by energy all the time. If we weren't being bombarded by energy, we wouldn't be here. Now, that energy causes the non-equilibrium state in the first place. So things like Lorenz's model of the weather, of turbulent flow, was driven by an energy differential between the bottom and the top of a hot plate. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now that energy differential wasn't be there, neither would the water flow, and there wouldn't be any oil. It would be solid, a chunk of ice at absolute zero. So we are all embedded in flowing energy systems, and therefore we might be in homeostasis against that flow, but it's a non-equilibrium phenomenon.
That's right. Good, very, very good explanation. Now, so let's talk a little bit about Taleb. We're running on the hour pretty tight here, so let's talk a little bit about Taleb, and then I want to tell you something that I don't think you know, but I want to tell you where the Pareto ratio came from. So go on the on Taleb and let me know what you think about his anti-fragile concepts and whether or not you align with this thinking on antifragility for society.
I do. Yeah. I mean, the word I use is robustness, but it's the same concept. And anti-fragile is probably a better way of putting it, because if you say anti-fragile, your opposite is fragile. And that's the type of world we live in now, because neoclassical economists in particular emphasized efficiency. But efficiency is not robustness, anything but. If somebody thinks something is efficient, they think it's therefore robust. No, it's not. It's very, very fragile. And that's what COVID has taught us. We have a global supply chain which is extremely efficient and extremely fragile. So you don't want to make your bias fully towards efficiency. You want robustness as well. And that's, or anti-fragility as Taleb terms it. So it's a very good concept and a very good way of expressing it. And that would mean you deliberately do not try to achieve efficiency. Efficiency means you're 100% tailored to the current situation. If the current situation changes, you're fucked.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So we're going into the last point, and I promised I would try and teach you something. So this here, it's going to be hard to see, but what this is it's an astraguli bone. Have you heard of what an astraguli bone is?
I used to play knuckles with that as a kid, but I don't know where they come from.
Well, man, see, he's got such a vast well of memory there. You're right. It's a knuckle bone. But it's typically pulled from sheep, right? And they used this back in ancient Greece, and they would roll these dice, right? And the knuckle bone is shaped in such a way as there's like the 80-20 rule, right? The Pareto ratio actually is the probability of this bone die.
Oh, okay. So 80% of the time it'll fall on the curved bit, and 20% on time on one of the two flat bits.
It's actually got 4 sides, so it's 4 sides. 10, 40, 40, right?
Yeah, 40, 10, 40, 10. Yeah, okay, yeah.
Yeah, and so very interesting. And I imagine from the Greek standpoint, it's like they're rolling this, not like the Druids later in the Middle Ages or whenever they were, doing their mystical chants and stuff. But the Greeks, they had a different. They're very inquisitive, these Greeks, so they'd roll these die, and they'd notice a pattern in nature, at least when that Pareto ratio was becoming apparent. It would seem like there was some truth in those in those dice rolls, right?
That's fairly cute. Yeah, I didn't know that. That's a good one.
Yeah. So not like the game of Yahtzee, they actually called where all the die are actually all the same. In this game, they would have a Venus throw if they threw it, and they were all the same because they would go A, B, C, D, or alpha, beta. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
You'd have a side, and so if they were all different, then that was a Venus throw, one of beauty, right?
Diversity. Okay,
there you go, right? Complex system. It's not in. So, anyways, I really like that, and that's the end of today's episode. We're going to have Steve back again next week. Steve, let me know if you want me to rip through your Wikipedia article. I thought it was like a little mudslinging going on, and I'm kind of.
Oh shit! Yeah, I mean, yeah. Some neoclassicals had a go at me inside there. Absolutely.
Yeah. So I mean, I might have to, knock on their door and say, "Hey."
Glad to have you do that. I won't do it myself, of course, but that'd be great.
Okay. All right, my friend, until next week, and we'll roll it back one more hour, watch for the adjustment, and stay awesome as always, okay?
Okay, thanks a lot. See you, Daniel.
Bye.
Bye.